Okay, and we are on. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good whatever it is, wherever you are on this beautiful planet we all occupy. I'm Chris, also known as the Atheist Pastor, and today I am very excited. Actually, someone who I've watched a lot of his videos, so it's very, very exciting to speak face to face. Lloyd Evans, thank you for taking the time and welcome.
Thank you, Chris. An absolute pleasure to be on your channel.
Excellent. Now, look, most people are going to know exactly who you are, I'm sure.
Well, obviously.
a slightly bigger
I'm not
audience
that
than
famous. No.
Oh, I don't know. It's I've been getting messages from people saying, "Hey, can you get an autograph for me?" all day. It's been very exciting.
Okay.
But for those who aren't familiar, I guess if you could give us a bit of a background on who you are and what you do.
My name's Lloyd Evans. I am a former Jehovah's Witness, activist, writer, filmmaker, YouTuber, writer. I'm the author of the book, The Reluctant Apostate. I run the John Cedars YouTube channel, and I'm very passionate about drawing people's attention to the darker side of Jehovah's Witnesses.
So for anyone who does want to follow Lloyd, links will be below, so make sure you check them out. So the Jehovah's Witnesses, I guess most people know the Jehovah's Witness is when they either get a knock on the door or they see a very friendly person trying to give them a book. So what can you tell us about the Jehovah's Witnesses?
Well, where to begin? They are a fundamentalist group. They reject the label fundamentalist, just like they reject the label cult, and pretty much even the word creationist they reject, even though they're very much creationists. They reject anything that in their view has negative connotations, even if it does apply to them. But they are fundamentalist creationists. They're not young earth creationists, they're old earth creationists. And they believe that God chose them as his one and only channel, his only true religion, in 1919. And since that time, the leadership, which happens to be based in New York or the New York area, have been serving as God's faithful and discreet slave. They take a fairly innocuous verse from Matthew 24 that describes a faithful and discreet slave in the sense of it being like an illustration, and they say, oh, this is a prophecy. They're prophesying that there will be this slave who administers spiritual food at the proper time. And when they say spiritual food, what they mean is propaganda that promotes their organization. So they're very much about bringing people into the organization, hence why they're very visible on people's doorsteps and increasingly in city centers with their carts. Although it must be said that the preaching work isn't as effective for them as it used to be, because nowadays we have the internet and people can very quickly and very easily find out the truth about Jehovah's Witnesses doing a very quick search on Google. So they rely mostly on baptizing children, basically, to keep their numbers buoyant. But they have a number of issues with the religion. The top 5 that I talk about are shunning, the martyrdom of Jehovah's Witnesses by refusing blood transfusions, the proliferation and cover-up of child sex abuse, the dissuading of higher education, and their stance on domestic violence, which puts women and abused husbands in danger.
Okay, so obviously, I guess the attitude of Jehovah's Witnesses tends to be that they're just a typical Christian denomination like all the other ones, just with a few different beliefs. Now, I guess if we could talk about, you did mention that they're a cult, and off the bat, that's something I very much agree with. But if you could, I guess, give us a bit more insight into, I guess, the cult-like tendencies, the cult-like behavior. What makes them a cult?
Well, I do use the word cult about Jehovah's Witnesses, but my own attitude towards that word is probably different from most people. My attitude as an atheist is that the word cult and the word religion aren't that far off from each other. In fact, one's pretty much just a pejorative of the other. I think that there's such a thing as a soft cult. In other words, I can imagine a scenario in which an organization has mostly or uniformly positive teachings. It's just that their dogma is dogma. It's based on things that aren't true, in which case it would still be a cult in my book, because it's teaching children things that aren't true. So I view all religions to varying degrees as cults. When I apply the word to Jehovah's Witnesses, I'll be clear, I don't use that word if I'm trying to persuade an individual Jehovah's Witness, because it's obviously going to completely turn them off. And I'm interested in having conversations. But if I'm speaking to you, or if I'm speaking to someone who isn't going to be offended, then yes, I'll use that word, because it does apply. It's a very, very controlling group. They do not allow criticism internally of the organization. You are dissuaded from researching objectively about your beliefs. It's even problematic to access your own religion's manuals and written material, because certain older publications are very difficult to get hold of unless you buy them on eBay, or unless you go on apostate websites. Even some of the newer publications are accessible only on an eyes-only basis. So, for example, there's an elder's manual which lists all the many rules that you can be disfellowshipped for, and only elders have access to that. So you're being held to rules and procedures that you don't know about. Only elders know about them. So that tells you something about how secretive and controlling the organization is. There is no way of having a different interpretation of the religion that differs from what the leaders tell you. If you deviate in any way, shape, or form, you'll be disfellowshipped as an apostate, and your family will be essentially weaponized against you. You'll be estranged from them if they're believing Jehovah's Witnesses. So that's the nature of the organization, and it's obviously a side of the religion that you're completely oblivious to when they call at your door or when you encounter them on the street. They're not going to lead in with, oh, by the way, once you join, you're not allowed to question and you're not allowed to change your mind. They're only going to hit you with, oh, wouldn't you like to live in a world with pandas and watermelons and pomegranates and frolic in nature with wildlife? So yeah, that's the broad summary of the organization that I spend a lot of time talking about.
So obviously you've had a journey where you am I correct in saying you grew up in the organization?
Yeah, correct.
I guess how did you find your way out of it? Because obviously, like you said, there is a lot of control, a lot of, I guess, emphasis on not researching, not looking at things on your own. How did you make that journey?
Kind of by accident. I was starting to, quote unquote, wake up when I was around 19 or 20. I actually went to a convention of Jehovah's Witnesses, because every year they hold conventions. They're not holding conventions this year because of coronavirus, but usually they have these mass gatherings, usually at sports arenas.
So they're not one of the ones that are still pushing through regardless then?
They've actually been,
or have they tried to? Or?
With one or two exceptions, which your viewers probably don't want me to bore them with, that they've been mostly good on coronavirus, I have to say. I can imagine them being far less responsible, but they've basically started doing everything remotely, and they're not holding their conventions. But the conventions are yearly events, and it used to be, not so much now, but it used to be that they were used as opportunities to release new literature. And when I was 19 or 20, they released a book on Daniel, on the prophetic book of Daniel, which I was very excited about, because I saw this as an opportunity to kind of understand more about what the very latest kind of quote unquote new light, they call it new light whenever they come out with a new understanding of the Bible. I saw it as my chance to kind of keep on top of things. And so I took this book home with me and I devoured it. And something very unexpected happened, which was that I started disagreeing with some of the conclusions that they were reaching. They just didn't make sense. And
how do you process that as someone who has been in an organization, such a controlling organization for such long? Incidentally, just so you know, if at any stage it seems as though I've spoken over you, it's because of the gap we've got in
no, I'm happy.
Other side of the world. So
no, I don't want to do a monologue. I don't want to do a monologue. This is a conversation. No, it's a very good question, actually. Yeah, it's a very good question. It's very disconcerting when you first start disagreeing, because you know you're not supposed to. You know that because they teach you that apostates are, they literally use the words mentally diseased. The very latest language that they've come out with is corrupted in mind. So when you first start mentally recoiling at some of the teachings that you are supposed to agree with, your first thought is, oh no, I'm becoming an apostate, or this is my fault. This says something negative about me, that I can't accept this. So I was so terrified that I was disagreeing consciously with what I was reading that I couldn't even bring myself to write down in the margins of the book, I disagree with this. Instead, I just folded the page so that I knew that there's a problem here, and then I'd carry on. And that was my first experience of apostatizing away from the religion. But then what happened was my mother died when I was 21, and the way the religion responds to death and bereavement is to say, oh, well, your loved one isn't quite dead. They're still alive in Jehovah's memory. They're kind of in stasis almost, because Jehovah's remembered everything about them. And in the future paradise, he is going to resurrect them. He's going to reconstruct everything that made them who they are, so that you can be reunited with them. All you need to do is be a good follower, so that you get to be reunited with them in the future. So I genuinely believe that my only chance of seeing my mother again was to put all of these doubts to one side and to just plow straight ahead with my career as a Jehovah's Witness. And it wasn't until maybe 10 years, less than 10 years later, I was 30, through a series of events which were very unexpected. I ended up moving to Croatia, because I'd met my wife through the religion and she was Croatian. And for the first time, I couldn't understand what was being said at the meetings. There was the language barrier. And so it was literally like being unplugged from this constant barrage of indoctrination. And for the first time, I had like breathing space to think, oh, hang on, what do I really believe? Am I just following along with this, or is this something I genuinely believe? And it didn't take long for me to realize, oh, actually, I don't believe this. I'm literally just going along with it because that's what everyone expects of me.
And how does that conversation, I guess, go with your wife in particular? Because obviously she's in the religion. You would have been well aware of shunning, which we'll get to later as well. How do you go through that process?
With great difficulty, because it's the sort of thing that destroys marriages. I'm very fortunate in that my marriage survived my apostasy, but the same can't be said of others. First of all, you're faced with this kind of existential turmoil of, oh no, everything I thought I knew about the universe and life and reality is wrong. And now I've got to start from scratch figuring out what's true and what isn't true. And in the process, you're also thinking, I'm married to someone who needs and expects me to be in this religion. If we have children, what do we do about our children? If we're planning on having children, what do we do about those plans? Probably we're going to get divorced. Oh my God, what's going to happen? So I actually couldn't bring myself to verbalize my problem to my wife, at least to begin with. I actually had to write her a letter, because I thought, if if she reads it, if she sees that I've actually committed these thoughts to paper, she might take them more seriously. If I just say it to her, she might think I'm pulling her leg, or she might think I'm being in some way devious. I want her to know I'm serious, and I also kind of can't bring myself to look her in the eye as I'm saying this. So I was very cowardly. I wrote her a letter, but in the end, she was about a year behind me. But all of the things that I was bringing up, saying, well, this doesn't make sense to me, and this doesn't make sense to me, and what on earth are we doing here? And she didn't really have an answer to any of it. She kind of realized, he's not just doing it to get rid of me. He's not just doing it because he wants out of the relationship. He's serious. And, maybe I'm wrong as well. So I was very fortunate in that she ended up joining me.
And as you're, I guess, in the process, or as you're going through the process of leaving, do you then have the elders, or what are is it they're called the elders in Jehovah's Witnesses? Yeah. Do they then try to intervene, or especially if your wife was a year behind you, how do they then react to you and her?
That was interesting. Yeah. So at one point, an elder pulled my wife to one side at the meeting. My wife went to the meeting and she was pulled to one side, and they said it was a new elder who just joined the congregation, who I hadn't even met yet. And he joined from the Bethel, and because I'd originally sat down with my elders and said, look, I'm having some issues here. I have doubts, and rather than going around and preaching to people about things that I'm uncertain of and going to attend meetings, I'm actually going to sit back and I'm going to just go inactive. Don't worry, I'll still be there for the annual memorial celebration, but I'm out, sort of thing. And what they could have done, my elders, is interpret this as a disassociation and arranged for me to be shunned. They were far more liberal and didn't go down that route. But when this new elder joined, he had a different approach, and he just assumed that there must be more to it. And he must be hiding some kind of sin. No one just stops believing like that. So he pulled my wife to one side at the Kingdom Hall and said, we know Lloyd treats you like a rag for cleaning the floor. What's he doing? Tell us what he's doing. And my wife was like, what on earth are you talking about? That's not what Lloyd's like at all. And actually, should we even be having this conversation? Shouldn't you be asking him yourself? So she came home and told me all of this. And what that did was, it actually, because I've been an elder, I spent a year as an elder before coming to Croatia. I know how the rules work. And I knew that what had happened was against even the elders' rules. They're not supposed to handle things in that way. So I said to the elders, you're going to apologize for handling things in that way, or I'm never going to speak to any elders again. And I knew that they would not apologize, because elders never apologize. And so that gave me the breathing space, knowing that they would never be coming to visit me. That gave me the breathing space to kind of continue on with my learning process and with my early attempts at activism without being disturbed.
So obviously, to go from, I guess, to take the step from just someone who's leaving the church to your activism, can you tell us a bit about, well, I guess you've covered some of the activism, but what led you to, I guess, want to take that step?
It wasn't something where I thought, oh, well, I'm going to become an activist. I'm going to become a writer and a YouTuber. First of all, YouTube only began in 2005. So when I left in 2011, YouTube was still a fairly recent thing. And the reason why I called my book The Reluctant Apostate is because I kind of thought, if I ever become an apostate, I'll be a reluctant one. I won't be one of those people who's, publicly criticizing the organization. That's just not me. But what happened was that the more I did research and the more I realized the scale of the deception, the scale of the various scandals and flip-flops and false predictions, and just how obvious it was that we're dealing with a corrupt man-made organization. I thought, how can I not talk about this? So I started, first of all, participating in forums, and I progressed from there to writing blog articles, which people seemed to find interesting. And then there was a development in America where a sex abuse victim called Candace Conti won a large lawsuit, which later got changed on appeal, but she had this big victory in America. And my partner at the time, who'd helped me set up jwsurvey.org, he said, there aren't really any videos talking about this on YouTube, Lloyd. Why don't you're good at making videos? Why don't you make a video? So that became one of my very first YouTube videos, and it didn't feature me in person. I wrote the script for it and got someone else to narrate the script. But that was my first foray into YouTube. And then later on, finally, my wife and I decided that we were going to publicly exit the organization. And then I became more visible as an apostate, yeah.
And what was the reaction you got from, I guess, people that you knew within the organization, and from, I guess, well, other people? You know, I'd imagine you have a lot of people who get in contact with you from within the organization still. But what was that like? What was that initial sort of reaction?
It was very painful, because usually when you're a Jehovah's Witness, you kind of know lots of people because you're always going to witness events and you're visiting different congregations and mingling at assemblies and what have you. And I had quite a large social circle. And so for all of a sudden, literally hundreds of people to just turn around and start shunning me. I mean, you could even see it happening on Facebook. You're counting your Facebook friends and seeing the number drastically going down because everyone's unfriending you. Yeah. And then there's the very heated, very emotional exchanges with family members who are Jehovah's Witnesses, who are absolutely aghast that this is happening, because they don't just view this as your personal decision. They take it very personally because it reflects on them, and they're going to have to be dealing, in fairness, with lots of questions and lots of people saying, "Oh, what's happening?" And so it's a very, very painful and tumultuous experience to actually detach yourself. But it's one of those things where the more time passes, it's a little bit like a divorce, I suppose. I've never been divorced, but I would imagine in the initial stages, it's very, very traumatizing. But the more time passes, everyone just beds down and thinks, well, this is the situation, we'll just get on with it. And that's more or less where we are now, although I am still being shunned by my father, who is a Jehovah's Witness elder, and he hasn't met either of his grandchildren, my two daughters, because both were born after my wife and I exited the organization.
And I can imagine that's a very painful thing for you, and I'd imagine, I guess that gets into that whole cult mindset that it must be an extremely hard thing, I guess, for him at the same time, that the religion's got that kind of control. So there's, and how many years? Well, 2011 you got out, so 9 years.
Well, it was at the end of 2013 that we disassociated formally. So okay. He was in contact with me right up to that point. So for a while we were contacting, even though he knew that I no longer believed. But his final straw was, if you get disfellowshipped or you get disassociated, I am going to shun you. And so he was true to his word. And yes, it is. It's one of those things again where the more time passes, the more it's kind of an emotional survival trait. You learn to cope, and your emotions and your relationships with others kind of calibrate to compensate. But I won't deny that his response to it all, which was partly informed by his indoctrination and the way he's being controlled by the organization, and was partly down to, I think, frankly, his cowardice, because he could have, if he was more engaged as a father, I think he could have been more noticeable in trying to salvage me. If he really believed that it was the truth, I still struggle with why he didn't go to more efforts to sit me down and say, right, okay, I know this is the truth. So you come at me with your very worst argument, and I'm going to prove to you that it's the truth. He didn't do any of that. He just basically ran for the hills. So there's part of me that kind of is able to give him a lot of leeway, because his mind is not his own. His mind is under the control of external forces. But to a certain extent, I'm not going to let him off the hook that easily, because I am a father myself. And if you're going to tell me that there's ever going to be a time where I'm going to pretend that either of my two daughters are dead because they disagree with me on something, I'm going to laugh in your face. So now that I am a father myself, it makes it even harder.
I struggle with that concept myself. Yeah. It's
the paternal bond is so strong. In other words, that when you experience it, there's no way you could imagine shunning. But that should tell you how much control this organization has over people.
So what do you think has led them to become, I guess, move away from what they started as, which I think was originally just a Bible society, into, I guess, the controlling organization that they are today? It's why have they gone down that route?
I think it's just, well, one thing you notice is that when you compare Jehovah's Witnesses with different groups, which is something I've done on my channel a number of times now. So I've had former Muslims on my channel. I've had former Mormons on my channel. I've spoken to ex-Scientologists. And what's very interesting is that you see the same traits popping up in each of those religious groups, even though the theology might be worlds apart. So, for example, lots of people think that Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses must be more or less the same because they're both on people's doorsteps. The theology is completely different, But what's interesting is, and you see this in nature as well, they call it convergence evolution. So there's the hummingbird hawk moth and the hummingbird, when they're hovering at a flower, look very, very similar and use exactly the same strategy, because it just so happens that's the optimum way of getting the amount of nutrients from the flower that they need. And it's a little bit like that with cults. They don't necessarily, in my view, set out thinking, we're going to micromanage people's lives, we're going to control people, we're going to make it impossible to criticize our dogma. They don't necessarily set out like that. But what happens is, over time, they gradually move in that direction if they're not careful, so that even though you have lots and lots of different groups with very, very different theology, the methods that they have for controlling people end up being exactly the same. So for example, with Scientology, they have what's called fair gaming of former members. Yeah. They label them as suppressive persons. Well, Jehovah's Witnesses use the term apostates. And they have, instead of disfellowshipping, they have disconnection. It's all basically the same. The way I describe it is, it's like different bodywork, but if you lift the hood, it's the same engine whirring away underneath. So that's the way I look at it.
So with the I guess most famously known for the knocking on doors. Now I believe that leads to that's all part of trying to become a part of the 144,000 that will get to rule. Is it go to heaven or rule in heaven, or what's the?
No, that's not really what it's about.
Okay.
So the knocking on doors is just, they've always been all about recruitment, going right back to the earliest beginnings. One thing that the first leader, Charles Taze Russell, was very good at was recruiting people to effectively serve as publicity agents for him. He called them colporteurs. And people would literally go around selling books for the organization. And that kind of mentality of going to people's homes or trying to spread the message as far and wide as possible has always been there. The theology about the 144,000 has changed over the years. So it used to be that when it was a small group, they called themselves the Bible students, and incidentally, there still are Bible students. This is before there was a split. There was only, let's say, a few tens of thousands, if not maybe 100,000 or so Bible students, mostly on the eastern seaboard of America. So when they were talking about people joining, they were talking about people who would join and go to rule in heaven with Christ. In other words, the 144,000 mentioned in Revelation. But as the religion grew and grew and grew, and there was it splintered off to become Jehovah's Witnesses, and it started getting into the millions, suddenly they needed to look back at, oh, hang on, how can there only be 144,000 going to heaven when there's millions of us, or potentially millions of us? And what they did was very cleverly come up with like a two-tier Christianity, is what I call it. So that part of when the Bible's speaking about the 144,000, the Bible is supposedly referring to the leadership, essentially, of the organization, or people who are Jehovah's Witnesses who think they're going to heaven. But mostly when it's speaking about people who survive Armageddon, who get saved into the paradise earth, it's talking about the other sheep that Jesus referred to when he said, I have other sheep who are not of this fold. So when witnesses call at your door, they're not expecting you to say, oh yes, I'm going to go and rule in heaven with your 144,000. They're recruiting you to join the Armageddon survivors whose number is infinite, basically.
So they're recruiting the working class for the 144 to rule over.
Basically.
So as far as the leadership, I mean, how does that come about? How do you become an elder? Is there a process? Is it how does that happen? And then I guess who decides who's running the organization? Is there a Jehovah's Witness Pope, for instance?
There isn't a Pope. There's 8 of them. So it used to be a bit like a Pope situation. In the early days, the organization was run by a president, the president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania, and he had under him his board of directors. But then in the 1940s, they started using the term governing body, and someone had the bright idea of, oh, well, maybe this phrase governing body should somehow link to the apostles. So maybe we should start thinking of the board of directors as being a bit like the apostles in early Christianity. And then that thinking or that theology kind of morphed into, rather than having a president, let's have a ruling council of apostle-like figures who are a governing body over the religion. And that happened, that final switch happened in 1975. And since then, you've literally had a very small nucleus of mostly white dudes in upstate New York ruling over millions of Jehovah's Witnesses. But if your question is, how do you rise through the ranks? It really helps if you've got a penis, because you can only be an elder or have any real authority within the organization if you're a man. It's a very male-centric, patriarchal organization. So once you become a ministerial servant, which is a bit like a deacon, you're then considered for becoming an elder, which is a bit like a priest, only a single congregation has numerous elders rather than only one priest. And once you're an elder, you might be considered for becoming a circuit overseer who visits lots of different congregations and make sure they're all doing things according to the way the organization wants. The circuit overseers are controlled by branches that are dotted all around the world, and the branches are controlled by the governing body. So that's basically the hierarchy. Yeah.
So what? So at that local level, then you mentioned that you had been an elder. Once you become an elder, what's expected of you? Obviously, making decisions about shunning is one of them. But what are your day-to-day duties, I guess?
So when you're an elder, you're very, very busy. And the extent to which you are busy depends on what privileges you've been given. So there are some privileges or roles within the congregation that are very intensive. So, for example, the coordinator of the body of elders will be responsible for calling elders meetings and arranging the meetings at the Kingdom Hall, figuring out who's going to be giving what talk, organizing the administrative side. The coordinator, the secretary, and the service overseer are like the main three elders, and they all again have more roles, all to do with kind of the functioning and administration of the organization. But even just your regular elder will usually have quite a lot on his plate. The way I refer to it is kind of being on a hamster wheel. When you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're kept extremely busy. And this has the effect of making it harder for you to, again, just take a step back and think, hang on, am I being exploited here, maybe? The busier you are, the harder it is for you to just take a step back and question things. So elders are especially busy. But even if you're not an elder, even if you're, say, a pioneer, which is a witness who commits to doing 70 hours per month in the preaching work, and you can be a man or a woman to do that. There's lots of ways that the organization comes up with, lots of jobs, some of which are sort of understandable, but some of which are really pointless. You think, surely there's a more effective way of doing this. But again, the busier you can keep people, the harder it is for them to question what's what. So
I'm assuming you would have gone and knocked on doors back in your day.
Oh, lots of doors. Yeah.
How obviously, recruitment is part of it. What's the process? If so, you've knocked on someone's door and they're prepared to have maybe a brief conversation with you. How would you have, or how do the Jehovah's Witnesses now approach that?
It was slightly different when I was doing it. Hang on, let me think about it. In Australia, you don't have GDPR, do you? It's a European thing, I think. But
not too sure. I haven't heard of it. So
it used to be when I was in the UK as a witness, you couldn't have a conversation with a Jehovah's Witness without them making copious notes about you. So it might still be the same in Australia because they're not under GDPR. So a Jehovah's Witness knocks on your door and you have a long conversation. That witness is going to disappear around the corner if they're not in Europe. So if they're in Australia or America or Canada or wherever, and they're going to write things down like Chris works as an office manager. His dog is called Rover. He has 2 children, Joe and Samantha. And they're going to write down as much information as they can remember about you so that the next time they visit, which will typically be a week to 2 weeks, they'll be able to just pick up where they left off. The aim will be to move you as quickly as possible to having a Bible study in their approved Bible study book, which is called What Does the Bible Really Teach? There's a slightly different title to it now, but it's a small book. And what you will then do is you will commit to meeting with them every week for maybe an hour and going through a portion of the book, and you'll read paragraph after paragraph. And when at the end of each paragraph, they'll ask you a question, which is already provided in the book, and your answer must correspond with what's in the paragraph. So you can't just ad lib and come up with your own answer. It has to conform to what's written in the paragraph. It's actually okay if you just read verbatim from the paragraph, so long as the answer's correct. So if you've managed to get through this entire process without there being any red flags at all at how creepy and cult-like this is, at some point or other, they're going to say, well, do you want to get baptized? How do you feel about, or what they might do first of all is invite you to some meetings. And the more meetings you attend, they'll start asking if you're interested in coming with them preaching, at which point you'll become what's known as an unbaptized publisher. And basically, the further down the rabbit hole you go with this, there'll be more and more pressure for you to get baptized, and at which point you basically become a witness yourself.
Okay, it's funny you mentioned the taking the notes. My wife is one of the friendliest people in the world. So whenever there's a knock on the door, she'll stand there and have a conversation for an hour, and doesn't really know how to say go away.
Yeah.
But they always came back and they always knew things, and there'd be times where I'd answer the door and they'd say, "Oh, Chris, and how's this going?" And I'd be like, "Wow, you know a lot." And it is a little bit.
They've literally just when you open the door, if you'd seen them, maybe just a few seconds before, they'd have been in their car with the notebook, saying, "Oh, this is his name's Chris, and if he answers the door, ask about this." And so, yeah, that's how much they prepare things. And in Europe, they now have GDPR regulations, which actually makes this illegal. So the organization in Europe has had to tell witnesses not to keep these records, and they do things now in a very different way. I think, to be honest, it's transitioning more towards the cart witnessing and finding, I suppose, in a way, less intrusive ways of doing it. But if they can get away with it, if the local rules, such as in Australia, around data protection, allow them to get away with it, they will do it. They will write down an essay on you and prepare for their conversations accordingly.
So with the cart witnessing, I've seen them out plenty of times. I've never seen anyone walk up to them. How effective? I mean, how effective really is that?
Yeah.
Is that because it just looks like a monumental waste of time? And I always see, they're very well dressed, and there's normally a poor kid or two that's sort of standing there, probably trying to hide from the school friends. But does that have a good hit rate, I guess?
Well, that goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that it's getting harder and harder to convert people into the religion in the internet age. Because it's funny, because when I was a Jehovah's Witness, bear in mind, YouTube wasn't really such a big thing when I was a witness, or it was in its earliest beginnings, but you did have the internet. And so I'd have a really interesting conversation with someone, and I'd maybe start calling on them quite frequently, and maybe I'd be leaving them with Watchtower and Awake magazines, and I'd maybe be thinking about convincing them to do a Bible study, and all of a sudden it would abruptly stop, and they'd say, "Actually, Lloyd, if you don't mind, I'm really not interested in this." And it happened again and again and again, to the point where, even though I was pioneering for 9 years, devoting dozens of hours every month to preaching, not once did I bring someone into the religion from the doorstep. And I always wondered why. And it's only when you get out that you realize that people have been on Google. That's all it is. And if you think about it, it makes total sense, because if say someone comes to your door and says, "I've got this absolutely amazing insurance product, you give us £5 a year and we'll insure your home for life," you're going to maybe be interested in it. But as soon as the door closes, you're going to jump straight on Google to find out whether it's a scam. And if it's a scam, you're not going to want anything more to do with it. And that's what's happening on a global scale with Jehovah's Witnesses. And that's why people aren't going up to them on the carts, or very few people are going up to them. But because the religion is now so big, and it's now 8.5 million members, as long as they can indoctrinate the children, they stand a chance of at least staying afloat, or at least keeping their growth, flatlined rather than dipping. And that's basically what they're doing. Yeah.
Obviously, 9 years without getting a convert, and obviously you're someone who you know how to communicate. I assume that you were fairly well versed in it all, had all the answers. So that's a really interesting trend, actually. So I guess you do see the TV shows. Is it Sophia and is it the Jehovah's Witness TV show for kids?
Oh, Caleb and Sophia, the cartoons.
Yes. I've seen some of those. They're interesting,
monstrous, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, that's probably the nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
What's the strategy then to keep the kids in? Because obviously I know it's when I was in the church, one of the things that we spoke about was as soon as kids go to university, that's where a lot of them will drop off. So what are the strategies?
Well, that's part of the strategy, is stopping them from going to college or university. And
of course, yeah.
College and university is very heavily frowned upon in the organization's literature and in the videos. But as is the case with most, if not all, religions, in my view, I'd struggle to think of a religion that doesn't, to at least some degree, depend upon child indoctrination, because children are inherently trustful of what their parents tell them. There's a very sound evolutionary reason for this, namely, if they distrust their parents and are skeptical about everything their parents tell them, they're just going to put their hand in the fire and they're going to do all sorts of stuff and end up dead. So of course they're going to be trustful. So when your parents tell you,
I've got a 3-year-old who won't do as she's told. So maybe I need to get some advice from the
within reason. I know how it works. But yeah, you believe what your parents tell you, and the organization knows this. So they've produced materials like the cartoons that you mentioned, Caleb and Sophia, that are designed to make it as easy as possible for parents to indoctrinate their children with beliefs that they may not fully understand themselves. But so long as there's this constant production line of brand new Jehovah's Witnesses, that at least the organization's in with a chance of surviving.
What about, and I know this is something with kids, and I say this because it's it's in about 15 minutes, it's my son's birthday. But Christmas, birthday, they're things that kids love. And obviously the Jehovah's Witness kids are still going to school. They're still around a lot of this. How is that dealt with internally? Because I'd love nothing more than my birthday as a kid. You know, it's I couldn't imagine life without it. So how are they getting around that while still trying to keep the kids interested?
Well, what you find is that when you're deprived of something that everyone else is doing, but it's maybe not a life or death matter, it's just something that everyone else enjoys. If you're deprived of it your entire life and you have no experience of it, then why would you miss it? So I never felt left out when it came to Christmas or birthdays. I did perhaps wonder what the attraction was, and I was maybe curious as a child as to whether there was any possibility that I might find it interesting. And certainly the idea of being given presents was very appealing. But for the most part, wanting to keep Jehovah happy was more important to me than having presents on a particular day of the year, whether it was Christmas or my birthday. And so what you find is most people who've been raised as Jehovah's Witnesses are fairly indifferent about the whole thing. It's actually quite tragic because I obviously celebrate Christmas with my children as an atheist. We're an atheist family, but we still can enjoy Christmas. But I know that it would mean perhaps a lot more to me if I'd never had the Jehovah's Witness upbringing. In other words, I basically do it for the kids. It's not something I'm particularly keen on myself. Other ex-Jehovah's Witnesses might see things differently and they might be more excited about it. But for me personally, I could take or leave Christmas, quite honestly. It's more for the children. And same thing really with birthdays. I get far more excited about my children's birthdays than I get excited about my own birthday, which I suppose is natural anyway. But it's one of those things where you just adapt, basically.
It's interesting because I've had a similar conversation with a mate of mine, not Jar Witness, who you probably know. He said the same thing. So with kids, obviously kids going to, is there a discouragement for kids to associate with other kids, I guess, out of school hours? I mean, is there, do they still get to go over and play or do sports? What happens?
I did occasionally go to my school friend's house as a child, but mostly I was friends with children of other Jehovah's Witness parents. I wonder what exactly the reasoning was, because really children aren't supposed to have any friendship with their school friends outside of school. In fact, Jehovah's Witness children are even told that when they go to school, they're not just going there to learn, they're going there to preach. So they're told that the classroom is essentially their personal territory that the congregation can't get into. So it's their job to use any opportunity to share their beliefs with their classmates. So they view their classmates as potential converts and people who they kind of have to put up with, but they otherwise are to view anyone who isn't a Jehovah's Witness as quote unquote bad association, which means that they are to limit their association with them.
Okay, that would have to be. I just can't imagine that for kids. That would be a. But I guess if it's what you've grown up with, it's what you're used to. One big issue I've got with, I've got a lot of issues. Blood transfusions. Now, I guess maybe not everyone realizes that Jehovah's Witnesses won't have blood transfusions. They refuse them for children, which I think is just, I believe actually in Australia, they're hopefully about to make that illegal on a nationwide basis, which is a positive. But how, and I understand it's from the verse about not taking blood in, but that's, I mean, when I read that, that's clearly to do with eating, and it's around the context. How have they gotten to that conclusion about the transfusion, considering 2,000 years ago blood transfusions weren't a thing?
Yeah, well, that's the million-dollar question, and I suppose we'll never fully know, because it was dreamt up in 1945. We don't precisely know who came up with the idea. It would have been during the Nathan Knorr presidency, and at that time, Nathan Knorr was kind of the Pope-like figure of the organization, and he kind of delegated a lot of the theology or the new teachings to a man named Fred Franz, who was, you could argue, one of the principal writers of the literature. But whoever it was, they came up with this teaching, which has since, it's been estimated, claimed tens of thousands of Jehovah's Witness lives. And as you say, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, not just the fact that the Bible writers wouldn't have known anything about using blood for medical reasons. Of course, they were only talking about eating it. But also the blood teaching as applied, as insisted upon by the leadership, is internally inconsistent. So since 2000, witnesses have been allowed to, on a conscience basis, so this doesn't mean that they get a free pass. It just means that if their conscience allows, there are certain blood derivative products that they can have for medical purposes, such as hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin performs mostly the function of blood. It's the stuff that makes blood red. It's the contents of a red blood cell. So if you think of a red blood cell, it's like a disc shape, isn't it? It's a red blood cell is basically hemoglobin with a wrapper. And so what they say is, take the wrapper off and you can use the hemoglobin, which actually, if you just inject hemoglobin into your body, it kind of has detrimental effect more than anything. It needs to have the wrapper. So they're very, very pernickety about how they do it. And this has led to all sorts of contradictions, internal contradictions. So they say that you can basically have almost anything that's in the blood, so long as it's not, number one, red blood cells, number two, white blood cells, number three, plasma, which is incidentally bad for the coronavirus because they're obviously developing treatments based on plasma. And number four, platelets. So those four things, they say you can't have. And that's because it just so happens that when you spin blood in a centrifuge, that's how blood divides. So apparently God has decided all this based on the way blood responds under centrifugal forces, which is again, nonsensical.
Makes complete sense to me. I mean, I think I'm convinced.
If you're going to say that God doesn't want you to receive someone else's white blood cells, then how is it that a mother's breast milk, particularly in the first weeks of pregnancy, is absolutely teeming with the mother's white blood cells? So how come babies can receive their mother's white blood cells? And actually, it goes even further than that, because cow's milk has white blood cells in it. So they just don't think about it, quite frankly. And people are dying because of this, you know?
And that is, as much as we can kind of laugh at how ridiculous the belief is, that's a real problem. So if someone were to get a blood transfusion, is that a shunning offence, or is there a path back for them? Or
yes. And actually, one of my most recent videos on my channel called Angels of Death talks about the HLC arrangement, or the Hospital Liaison Committee arrangement, which you have there in Australia as well. So when a witness gets admitted to hospital and there's the slightest whiff of a chance that blood might be administered, these goons are sent in, HLC elders, to the hospital, basically to enforce the blood teaching and make sure that the patient refuses blood. Because actually, even though witnesses are supposed to refuse blood, anything can happen when they're on their own in the hospital and their life is on the line. You know, you can find that most people, under that sort of pressure, their survival instincts will cause them to, recoil against what their religion demands of them. But when you have these goons floating around from the organization, which they're allowed to do currently, and I'm taking the position that hospitals all over the world should be throwing these guys out. I mean, if it's truly a personal decision, why are there these people there enforcing this? So what happens is that due to this pressure, and also what doctors aren't told by these HLCs is, as you say, if a witness receives a blood transfusion willingly and unrepentantly, they can be shunned by everyone they know. So it's actually a shunning offense. So you're not telling me that there isn't coercion involved when people are literally being threatened with their entire social structure being turned on its head if they receive certain medical treatments.
I'm amazed that these goons are allowed into hospitals. That's actually something I'm going to look into, because if that's happening where I am, that's something that I'm going to be very keen to.
Well, that's why I made the Angels of Death video, and in the Angels of Death video, I actually say, please circulate this to as many kind of doctors and medical professionals as possible, because they frankly won't know this, and the HLCs are very good at going into hospitals and doing these fabulous presentations about blood alternatives, and we're just here to help you honor the patient's conscientious decision to abstain from. No, nonsense. They're there to make sure that the patient martyrs themselves if necessary.
That's just, it's insane. So if someone were to get a transfusion unwillingly, like a child, for instance, I guess that's okay if it's an unwilling.
It's a bit different with children, and what we're finding is in lots of countries is that, as you say, the state is intervening and taking matters out of the hands of parents. But make no mistake, the state does need to intervene and do that, because Jehovah's Witness parents are told that they need to, if it's in their hands, make sure that the child dies rather than receive a blood transfusion. And anyone who doesn't believe me, if you go on my channel and watch my video, The Martyrdom of Deride Scepter, they even on one of their propaganda videos celebrate the death of a 10 or 11-year-old back in, I think, 1990 or 1991, and use it basically to encourage more witnesses and more witness children to refuse blood. So that's that's what's going to happen if the state doesn't intervene. But thankfully, we are seeing in more and more countries the judiciary stepping in and stopping this from happening. Yeah.
Too easy. Now, I am mindful we've just hit the hour, so I won't keep you too much longer. It's just gone midnight here as well, so it's I do need my beauty sleep. Unfortunately, I'm not as blessed as so many out there. What advice? And I guess this is actually, and I guess we can take as much time actually as we need with this, or as you think is appropriate. When we're dealing with people who are in the religion, and we're trying to have these conversations with them, how best can we have these, or even if someone knocks on the door, how best can we have conversations?
With extreme kindness, and with the knowledge that when someone is a Jehovah's Witness, as I said earlier about my father, their mind is not their own. So they're not knowingly trying to fool you or deceive you. They are just going along with something that they've genuinely been convinced of. They're a cog in a much bigger system, and they're making the best of a bad situation. And what really isn't going to help is if you're rude to them, or if you mock them and deride them, or in any way make them feel persecuted, because they've actually been trained by their leaders to believe that if they receive any form of persecution from people, this is evidence that this is God's one true religion, because of course Jesus's followers would be persecuted. So if you encounter a Jehovah's Witness, even though you might be extremely annoyed, especially if they're disturbing you on a Saturday morning, do try as much as possible to be civil with them. What you can do if they call at your home is just respectfully ask that they put you on their do not call list, which means that they will endeavor to not call on you again. But if you do get into a conversation with them, and perhaps I would advise anyone to look up the work of Anthony Magnavosko, who's done some great work with street epistemology and the art of having dialogue with people who have very firmly entrenched ideas. If you do get into that sort of conversation, always just try to be kind and respectful, because that's all they're going to respond to is kindness.
Because I think it's fair to say the reality is you can throw any bit of theology or argument, you're not going to deconvert them at the door. Ever.
No, there's no magic bullet. If there were a magic bullet, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because anyone who knows a Jehovah's Witness would know exactly what to say, and it would be like a magic spell and alakazam, and suddenly they would be free of the cult. It's just not how it works. When you absolutely need something to be true, you're going to come up with any number of reasons for it to be true, even if the facts are staring you in the face.
So with, I guess, the Jehovah's Witnesses that we find in our lives, how have you found it, or what's an effective way, I guess, to talk to them and eventually help lead them out of the cult?
Again, street epistemology is a very good approach to take. It's basically just the art of asking questions, Socratic reasoning, explaining the value of evidence and of critical thinking, and examining claims objectively. So, yes, do look up the work of Anthony Magnavosko and research street epistemology if you are keen on trying to do what you can to help people, not just in Jehovah's Witnesses, but in other cults as well.
And I guess one last, but I think probably one of the most important questions I'll ask tonight, for those who are still within the organization but have had the doubts and are really looking for a way out, what advice would you give them?
It's good to have doubts. Don't hate yourself for having doubts. Doubts are normal. Doubts are healthy. What I try to say to people in that situation is that objective research is the way forward. It's actually what I call it a win-win scenario, because if you are convinced that you have the truth, then by doing the objective research and seeing what the complaints are against your religion and seeing what the grievances are and the arguments against your religion, if what you have is the absolute truth from God, then you're going to be able to refute any of the arguments that critics throw at the organization. And this will mean that by the end of the process of doing objective research, your faith will be stronger. Your faith will be rock solid. And your relationship with Jehovah, you might say, might be stronger. If, on the other hand, you're being lied to and exploited and manipulated, then, of course, the organization that's doing that is going to tell you not to listen to what the critics have to say. So by listening to what the critics have to say and objectively evaluating what they're saying, including seeing what the organization's own literature has to say objectively, then you'll finally be able to start thinking for yourself. So it's a win-win situation, no matter how you look at it. That's what I would say to any Jehovah's Witnesses watching.
Sounds like good sage advice, I think. There was a question that came through from Grumpy Old. He asked if Jehovah's Witnesses are encouraged to foster children.
I wouldn't say they're encouraged to foster children, but I'm not aware of there being anything against them fostering children, and that obviously raises its own concerns for the blood issue, because that could mean that they adopt a child that needs blood and they're going to refuse it. So, as far as I'm aware, there is such a thing as JW foster parents.
Okay, no dramas. Well, we might wrap it up there. Thank you so much for coming on. I feel like I could probably sit here and talk to you for the next 3 or 4 hours, but that's really it's not going to be good for me. We'll have all the links below where people can find you. For those who did like what you heard here. So this is what happens when it's midnight. It's my words.
Try saying judiciary. Yeah,
I'll leave that one to you. For anyone who has, if you like what you saw here, make sure you click on the link below, subscribe. Can people support you as well and what you do?
Yeah, I have a Patreon, and I'm very, very fortunate to have hundreds of people supporting me on there. So I'm overwhelmed, really, with how many people believe in what I'm doing. We also have a team on JW Survey, and so I'm very, I use the word cautiously, but I'm very blessed with an excellent team around me helping me do what I do.
It's one of those words that's very, very hard to give up. Trust me.
Yeah.
I still find myself doing it all the time. And what's really bad for me is when someone tells me something and my instincts to say, I'll be sure to pray for you, or I'll keep you in my prayers. And it's like, hang on, I don't have those anymore. So we'll shift to one side. So for everyone else, if it's your first time here, we've got Friday Night Six back on tomorrow night, which is basically where we get 6 atheists together. We all have a quiet drink and try and solve the problems of the world. Have a bit of fun, try and tackle the serious issues, but in a bit of a light-hearted sort of manner. For those who have come along and are still in religion, if you need any advice, any help to get out of religion, if you want someone to talk to, please send me a message. You can get me on Twitter, or even if you want to try and save my soul, I say, hey, bring it on. Well, I'll have the conversation with you. Everyone else, thank you so much for coming along. Thank you for watching. Once again, thank you so much, Lloyd, for taking the time out of your day to come and join me here. So everyone else, thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, good whatever it is, wherever you are on this beautiful planet. And thank you.